The phone buzzed at 3 in the morning, like a small animal shifting under the covers. I fumbled for it with sleep in my knuckles. The screen glowed, an anonymous number I didn't recognize, a motel area code I only knew in passing. "Don't come. Please tell them I'm sorry." The words arrived in a single brittle line, the kind that strips the room of its shape. I read it twice, because the second read is where people usually think they'll find an explanation. There was none. Just the two-line wedge of a message and a timestamp that would not stop nudging the inside of my skull. 3 a.m. I lived too close to that kind of hour. You either get used to the way the night rearranges facts, or you stay awake and argue with it until morning. I argued. I watched the clock count away the minutes, the small lamp on my table buzzing like a trapped insect. The lamp hum is a sound that keeps cropping up in places like this, cheap, incandescent, steady, somehow too domestic for the anxiety it lights. I could have ignored it. I did not. There are decisions you call impulsive afterward, and choices you call compelled. I called this one compelled. The number was tied to a motel, a name that could have been anywhere. I drove east out of the small city, then past the last strip of chain stores, past the sign that advertised vacancy in flickering neon. The rain had started as a film and became a small, constant rubbing against the windshield. At that hour, the world is a set of thin reflections. The motel's neon doubled in the puddles. The streetlights wore halos like small moons. When I pulled into the gravel lot, the motel looked like a stage left stranded after curtain call. Rows of doors faced a single lane. A sagging awning ran the length of the building. Somebody had written vacancy with a broken bulb, V-A-C, then a long pause of black, then N-C-Y. The outer lights burned a tired yellow. In the office, the counter held a jar of pens and an ashtray still warm with someone's cigarette, ash like soft gray snow. The clerk was behind the glass, a man who might have been 50 or might have been older if you count everything behind a person, years of late shifts, the sunless skin of someone who lives by night. He had the kind of voice that left lint in the corners of sentences, cotton soft and habitual. I told him the number that texted me. He looked at me. His face was a map of small decisions that never quite got made. "Room 304, he said after a beat. I blinked. It was the number in the message, and it matched the small typed sheet he slid from the drawer, a late printed reservation list. He shoved it across the counter like it was ballast. "You sure that came from here?" he asked. "It was from a motel number," I said. I didn't know who it was." He shrugged one shoulder in a way that suggested shrugging a body into something heavier. "They renumbered last spring," he added, as if that detail would help. "Used to be 7. That's the reason the logs look weird sometimes. You ever notice a room's number can change how folks remember it? He meant it literally. Rooms were renumbered when the town repainted, when the owner got tired of people associating a number with trouble. I heard the excuse and the old rhythm beneath it. People change numbers like people change addresses. The past keeps following the same door. He hesitated then, leaned closer across the counter. The smell of his breath was coffee that had melted into cigarettes. "Look," he said, and there was a small private syllable to the way he leaned. "I'm not trying to scare you, but if you're going in, leave the damn door cracked when you go. And," he paused, searching for what sounded like the right word, "look at the mirror. The cameras show things in that room." He kept his tone almost conversational, as if he were telling me about the weather. His voice would have been forgettable if not for the way he punctuated that sentence with an intensity that stripped the cotton away. "The cameras show I was never alone." He didn't phrase it like a story. He said it like a fact that made the wallpaper shiver. I asked him what he meant, and he shrugged as if offering a key with a rusted chain. "You see it when you play the footage back. Reflections, twice in the glass. Lights that don't follow the bulbs. People say what they want to, but He closed his mouth. The silence between us was the size of the counter. He said, "If you open that door, don't slam it. Don't make it obvious you're there for trouble. Some things get nervous when people make a fuss." I remember laughing because nervousness is a humanizing thing, and the laugh was a damp thing. He did not laugh. He gave me a room key like he had given it to everyone else, and his fingers lingered at the coin slot on the key ring, as if they were reluctant to let me walk away with it. There was a small photocopy hanging by a magnet on the doorframe behind him. "No loitering," the letters punched into the paper.
Someone had scrawled, "Also, watch your mirrors," in small, careful handwriting beneath. Outside, the rain steadied into a pattern, not quite a rhythm, and the neon haloed the puddles. Room 304 was under a flickering porch light. The door had a cheap metal handle. The key rattled in my palm. When I opened it, the smell came first, stale air that carried hints of smoke and room cleaner, and something softer like wet cloth. The lamp over the bed hummed, a low insect sound it seemed to hang in the threadbare air. There was a dresser, a cracked mirror over it, a nightstand with an unmanned lamp, and a blanket folded back as if someone had left in a hurry. On the dresser lay a Polaroid tucked beneath a cigarette stub. The photo had been taken hastily, edge cut off, someone's thumb smudged across the corner so the white border wore a gray crescent. In the picture, Lena stood at the center of the frame, a real person in a world of cheap paper.
She was smiling in a way that made me understand her laugh if I had not known it, slight, with a tuck at the corner of her mouth that suggested she was saving the best of her smile for someone else. There was mud on the hem of her jacket. The mirror in the photograph caught a shadow grazing the edge, a murkier rectangle where the light folded wrong. There was a cigarette still warm in the ashtray. Beside it, a small folded slip of paper wrapped in a bit of red thread. I untied the loop. The paper had 3 letters punched into it in blue ink, ragged as if someone had learned to write and not yet practiced the flattening of pressure. S-O-R. I did not know what S-O-R stood for. I have a tendency to alphabetize bad signs, to try to turn them into words I can put in a filing cabinet. S-O-R looked like the beginning of a sorrow. It looked like shorthand for apology. The Polaroid felt like a fossil you could read in layers, the way the mud smeared, the curve of Lena's fingers, the shadow the mirror swallowed at the edge. I slid the photograph into my coat pocket like I was stealing a memory, though there was no claim I could lay to it. I left the cigarette alone. I always leave cigarettes alone. Back in the office, I asked the clerk if the motel kept any tapes. He rubbed his jaw, the motion of a man trying to decide if the problem was worth putting his hands on. "We keep 'em a week," he said. "Depends on space. Someone comes by, they'll pull what they want, otherwise they get ridden over. I can try, but—" he paused. "You know how it is." "Can you check room 304's footage?" I asked. He was careful with his answer. "We only keep the front and the lot, but sometimes the housekeeping camera, the handheld one the cleaners use, they keep old K9s on an SD card. If someone saved something, it might be on a stick. People pocket things." As he spoke, he told a story about the housekeeping camera, as if describing the quirks of an animal. He said the cam sometimes recorded odd things, reflections off doors, late nights where movement made the lens whistle. He did not sound like he believed in hauntings. He sounded like someone who had seen too many odd reflections to be surprised. "You said the cameras show you were never alone," I said, repeating his phrase like a bell. "I said the cameras show things," he corrected quietly. "And sometimes, not always, the footage looks like there's company there when there isn't. People will tell you what they want. I don't want to say more than I know. Go slow." The clerk's warning hung with the same texture as the motel hum. It was a practical thing. Go slow, watch mirrors, watch the footage if you get it, leave doors ajar. And also, it was not just practical. He looked at me as if he had been making a ledger of small harms for years and had decided to hand me a thin sheet from the pile. I took the room. I should have called someone. I did not.
The kind of hubris that makes you think you can be useful in a situation often hides under the guise of simple curiosity. I took the Polaroid, the slip, the photo tucked into my pocket like contraband. I left the room exactly as I found it, blanket folded, lamp humming. The puddles along the walkway reflected my shape away from the building, as if signaling the town that I had become yet another reflection. That night I could not sleep. Every sound became possibility, a footstep, a distant engine, the refrigerator in my apartment engaging its near-silent cycle like a small animal. I spread the Polaroid on my kitchen table and put a glass over the folded slip, as if to preserve the breath in its fold. I dialed Marco because he is good at making impossible things sensible. He is a friend with software fingers and patient eyes. "What do you want me to do with a Polaroid?" he asked when I told him I'd taken it. "Look at it," I said. "Just look. Is there anything to do with this? Anything you can tell me about what's in the mirror?" He laughed, a soft sound that came with a tiny canal of skepticism. "You stole a photograph, and now you want me to read tarot. Send it." He was always practical in the way people are who have spent enough late nights with screens to believe in metadata. I had another message overnight,
a voice note from an unknown number that turned out to be Lena's. I played it once, then again, because there was a small part of me that thought my ears would find more on a second pass. Lena's voice was thin and close, the kind of voice that comes from a phone held in a bedroom. It began with a whisper, then settled into a flatness. "Please don't come. Please tell them I'm sorry." Breathy noise under the second line, like a small animal searching for air, or like someone shuffling a heavy sweater against skin. The recording ended on a note that held a small, residual trailing silence, as if the microphone had been gently put down. When I texted Marco the Polaroid and the audio file, he replied in fragments. "On my way. Coffee. Bring me everything." He arrived with a backpack full of tools and the kind of cautious curiosity that's less thrilling than it looks in movies. He spread the items on my table with the focus of someone at a small dissection. He handled the Polaroid like a relic. The slit of red thread unwound like a tiny red boat on a white sea when he opened the folded paper. "Look at this," I said, pointing to the photo. "See the mirror?" He looked, nodded. "I can clean the glare, enhance, bring out the shadow." He was careful not to promise. He boiled water for coffee as if ritual could straighten the edges of a bad night. He worked for hours, calibrating colors, stabilizing edges. From the Polaroid, he could pull almost nothing technical. Instantly, Polaroid silver halide goes where software cannot fully reclaim it, but he could sharpen light and lift a shadow. He made the shadow edge crisper, the smear of mud more legible.
He slowed the image until what had been a blur became an outline that didn't align with Lena's form. "There's a second shape here," Marco said, without myth, without flourish. But it could be anything that made a shadow at the time. Another person, a bag, a cut in the curtain. You can see where the reflection doubles. We need video. We asked the motel for footage. The clerk promised to check what he could. He called back the next day and said the front cameras only caught the lot, but then he texted a short snippet. Found a clip on a stick. Might be something. Bring a USB. His relief in the text felt like a small animal letting go of a weight. We drove back. The rain had left a metallic smell in the air. On the desk this time sat a plastic sleeve with an SD card inside. "Somebody dropped it off 2 nights ago," the clerk said. "Said they'd take a look. It had housekeeping footage." Housekeeping footage, as the clerk had said, is the kind of mundane technology that records the unnoticed. The clip started with a cleaner walking down the corridor, mop in hand, routine nothingness. For 7 minutes, it was the choreography of a job. Doors, doors, the small economic breathing of motel life. Then room 304 came into frame. The clip shows the cleaner opening the door because it's recorded from the cleaner's POV. The camera sweeps past the bed, past the nightstand, and when it lands on the mirror, there is a flicker, like a film used to running a second behind itself. The mirror catches a woman, Lena, sitting on the bed, her back to the door, and behind her, in the mirror only, there is the hint of somebody else. Not a clear face, not a hand, a shape leaning close enough that the woman's hair lifts as if in a breath. The camera never stops being faithful to its angle, but the reflection continues to register a presence that the rest of the frame denies. "Watch the time code," Marco said, fingers moving like a conductor. The time code stamped the footage with images of late afternoon and a date that didn't match the motel's usual logs. The pointer on the video jumped twice, as if the file had been opened and closed. "They don't always correspond with real time," Marco said, "but look at how the reflection moves independently." We replayed, frame by frame. At 03:17:34, the mirror shows Lena tip her head, slow, deliberate. Behind her in the reflection, the shape leans in. At 03:17:36, the cleaner's camera tilts, and for a fraction of a second, you can see the cleaner's shoulder in the doorway. There's a small sound, the sort of domestic scrape that could be a broom against tile, and then the clip jumps, resumes, and the angle finishes as if someone had closed the laptop and walked away. "Could be double exposure," Marco said, but the footage was digital. Double exposure's an analog problem. Could be editing, could be copy corruption, could be a person standing out of frame whose shadow lands in the mirror.
He listed possibilities like cigarettes, offered without the warmth of certainty. I watched until the video became less about what was on the screen and more about what it made room for in the body. The shape in the mirror had the space of someone leaning close enough to be heard, but the cleaner did not react. The cleaner did not look. The cleaner never entered the frame in the mirror. We kept rewinding. "You said the clerk told you cameras show people in that room," Marco said finally. He wasn't being dramatic. Some of these cheap rooms have ways of collecting images: reflection, window, derived mirror. If you sit in one spot, the camera in the hall can still pick up your reflection in the glass, but that doesn't explain why there's something in the mirror when there isn't anything in the room.
Either someone else was there, I said, or the mirror kept a version of them. He blinked like that was not a comforting hypothesis. The other thing, people tape themselves into things. Maybe someone made the clip. Maybe it was to send a message. But who would want to craft a message like that? Don't come isn't a sales pitch. We took a copy home. The file felt heavier on my hard drive than its data warranted. The motel clerk's voice did not come across in the recording. He was, in person, both meticulous and evasive. He had handed us the SD like a man clearing his desk of unpleasant papers. He said nothing more about the housekeeping camera, and yet told the story of its quirks as if trying to close an open hinge. It was the Polaroid that kept my hands in my pockets when people looked. It felt like a trespass into someone's domestic history. Maybe that made me complicit. Maybe it made me responsible. When you take a photograph, the subject's past becomes partially yours to attend. Word spread in small, slow-town increments. 2 people at a coffee counter, someone leaving a note at the bakery, a woman at the gas station who knew Lena's brother. The story aggregates itself in places like this. It collects people who need to tell, and those who pass on delight in the telling as if tidings were a cheap kind of bread. Mrs. Alvarez at the bakery knew Lena as a customer who liked her coffee black and always left a tip folded into napkins. She'd buy a pan dulce and stare out the window like she had a secret, Mrs. Alvarez said, kneading a rhythm into her voice. Not like she was hiding, just like she had more to say than the day would allow. She wrapped a pastry for me and pressed it into my hand like an offering for trouble. At the tow yard, Hamie told a story about a jacket that had been dropped off beside the river 3 months earlier. A kid found it by the guardrail, he said, chewing a straw with a concentration that looked like prayer. He had seen the jacket, red, frayed at the cuff, lined with a thin satin. He had set it aside in a bin because that's what you do when something like that turns up and no one claims it.
He did not know Lena, but he had a way of describing things that made them seem like they were cataloged in someone else's ledger. Sometimes you get a thing, you know it's got a story. You can feel it heavy in the weave. Someone left a small doll on the church steps one morning, stitched in a crude way with a length of red thread binding the seam across its back. It was the same hue of red as the thread around the folded slip in the Polaroid. The town's watch group, 3 chatty retirees who called themselves the Night Eyes, passed the doll around like a rumor. They took pictures and circulated them in a private group chat until the image spread like a smear of oil. No one admitted placing it where it was found. The old woman on the porch, the one with the nickel tray of lawn chairs and a cat that understood shipping routes, told a caution in a voice that smelled like mothballs and sugar. Cheap places keep a residue, she said. People leave themselves in rooms. She pointed to the cracked mirror in the gingham of her living room and tapped the glass as if reminding it to keep silent. She told me a story of a cousin whose neighbor's mirror collected the outline of a child who had been forgotten. Nothing dramatic, and they had kept the child's portrait in the attic like a family pet and said nothing. I listened because people who talk in parable are often trying to explain things that cannot be explained otherwise. There were other things, a text thread with Lena where she asked if anyone could meet her for coffee and canceled at the last minute, a coworker who said she'd left a shift early because she wasn't feeling well, a barista who remembered a laugh that stopped in the middle of a joke. Small things, human things, ordinary punctures in the fabric of a life. And still the footage kept its small, notorious secret. The clerk came back to us once, hands in his pockets, and said, "There's another tape. It was turned in from a trucker. He said he found it in the lot. It shows inside the room." A trucker's tape is the kind of thing you expect to be reliable, made by a man who lives by routes and knows the currency of time. He sat with us in my kitchen, watching the clip on mute. The trucker had screwed up a bit on the date, and the time was stamped early in the morning, consistent with the first message time. The clip was raw, grainy, the hall light making everything gold. It panned, and there, for a breath, the bathroom mirror registered someone standing behind the bed, hair like a dark cloud, hands lifting as if to steady the world. But there was no movement anywhere else. The bed was empty in the frame. The camera, angled from the trucker's dashboard through the open front window, caught a reflection, like a photograph catching a second shutter behind its first. When I asked the clerk why someone would hand in a tape like that, he shook his head. "Maybe they felt bad," he said. "Maybe they thought someone should see it." Sometimes people are good like that. There was a pattern forming, artifacts that would not assemble into a tidy explanation, Polaroids, audio with breath, Video clips with reflections that didn't reconcile with the visible frame. They were like bones of a skeleton without joints. They suggested movement without showing it, suggested presence while remaining reticent about identity. The town built an architecture around these fragments, a scaffolding of conjecture and worry. At a meeting of the watch group, an ad hoc gathering that convened at the back of the library because the regular meeting room was being used for a bridge club, they argued over how to document things. "We need to mount cameras," one said. The sheriff's deputy cleared his throat and reminded everyone that capturing evidence is a process. "We don't mount cameras to catch ghosts," he said, and for a moment his voice sounded like a man who knew how words could make a place more frightening when they were misused. The deputy was kind in that way some men are when a thing is both procedural and painfully human. He took down names, noted times, and asked questions about Lena without suggesting how she had been taken. No one could say for certain that she had been taken. She was missing, and that word opened up a vocabulary the town did not want to live in. There were also small, almost comic misalignments with the motel's numbering. The clerk, as if willing to confess one more minor sin, explained that when the owner repainted the hallway last spring, the numbers were shifted. Room 7 became 304 because the owner liked symmetry. "People still call it 7 sometimes," he said. "Old habits." I liked that detail because it gave me a plausible reason for the mismatch between rumor and record. You could file it under human error. You could use it to defend the neat world. If you step back, these things look like a slow, private crescendo. The little artifact stacked up like dust on a mantle, the Polaroid with its shadow, the jacket found by a riverbed and left on a tow yard shelf, the doll with a red thread sewn through its back like a small stitch of warning. You can collect this dust, and you can do nothing. The difference between people who wait and those who act is often just a matter of how much the dust irritates the throat. A junior reporter from the regional paper called and wanted to know if this was the kind of story that sells. "We run a piece on strange vacancies," they said, "and people come from miles around." I told them what I could without turning Lena into what she was not. I told the story like one wraps food for the road, carefully, with an eye toward preserving it. There are lines you don't cross even in curiosity. Lena wasn't a subject. She was a person whose artifacts were now in circulation, and that requires a kind of tenderness. Late one evening, Marco called.
He had dug into the SD card metadata and found an odd string of timestamps that suggested something else. The camera's internal clock was off by 23 minutes, but the embedded frames had a sub-second jitter that suggested either editing or a camera that was receiving intermittent interference. "Something's inserting frames," he said. "It's either a glitch or deliberate." He was the kind of person who would properly punctuate his doubt. The next clip that arrived was an anonymous transfer to my email, a short video shot from the inside of the room, karaoke style, a shaky vertical clip that starts with the mirror and pulls back to show Lena standing at the window. The mirror in the clip is cracked along a hairline, and the crack slices light into a dozen tiny knives. In the mirror, there is a second reflection. This time it is closer to being a figure, a silhouette leaning in with a posture that suggests attention, or whispering, or both. The uploader included no text, only the clip, and the file name was a string of letters that meant nothing. I didn't show it to the clerk. I didn't show it to the sheriff. I watched it alone, and the apartment's lamp hummed like an old insect. The clip was 30 seconds long. It ended with Lena's shoulders dropping, like someone unthreading a button. When it ended, my apartment felt smaller, and the lamp hummed louder. The air smelled of wet pavement and coffee. I thought of the two-line message, the first stool upon which the entire narrative leaned. "Don't come. Please tell them I'm sorry." It was an apology and a warning, and it arrived with a structural failure. It asked me to do something impossible. I told Mrs. Alvarez about the clip when I saw her at the bakery the next morning. She pressed a small cookie into my palm. "You can't carry everything alone," she said. "We are a town, after all." That night, I took the copies of the clips and the Polaroid to a group of neighbors who had begun to form a watch over small things, a loose fellowship of people who kept an eye on the motel, because it's easier to be watchful than indifferent. We played the clips on an old TV in the community center, the screen throwing the room into cold blue. People sat back in folding chairs and watched the mirror swallow, and when the figure leaned, one of the women in the front whispered "there," as if pointing at a photograph you have to name to keep it from floating. After the video, the clerk tapped me on the shoulder and said, "You saw it, you saw." He said nothing else. His fingers were the warm, rough hands of a man who'd been too many nights in too many rooms.
He would say later that he had warned me, but at the time he simply looked like a man who wanted to be less alone in knowledge. We formed habits then, to document, to label, to make a practice of bearing witness. People walk the lot at odd hours, not to be brave, but because routines make fear smaller.
A watch group convened to catalog items found around town. A hair tie on the fence by the river, a small scrap of thread, a matchbook with Lena's favorite dieter stamped on it. We made lists. We wrote down the dates. The deputy took what he needed and said we should not treat the phenomenon as proof of supernatural cause, yet he sat with us and watched the same clips, and his jaw tightened in a way that suggested charts had collapsed into feelings. One morning, Jaime from the tow yard called in a tremor of voice. "There's something you need to see," he said. "A jacket turned up, red, lined." I drove out to the yard because that's what people do when the world begins to tilt. You go back to where things are cataloged and let other people's inventories help you contain the unknown. Jaime had the jacket folded on his workbench, rain dots freckling the cuffs. Tucked in a pocket was a Polaroid, not the same one. A second photograph, this one of Lena standing near the riverbank, hair sticking damp to her forehead. Someone had written across the back in block letters, S.O.R. We did not know whether S.O.R. was a fragment, a word, an apology, or an attempt at shorthand only the writer understood. We did not know if the jacket had been at the river for days or months. We only knew that the jacket had been found and that the Polaroid inside matched, in a strange palimpsest way, the first image, the cracked mirror, the reflected shadow at the border. The jacket was evidence and it was grief wrapped in fabric. It drew the town like a flare. Lena's mother arrived with a stoic gravity that reframed the whole thing from a strange, small communal curiosity into a personal emergency. She asked for the jacket with hands that were steady when she touched the pocket, and she kept the Polaroid in her palm and did not let it go. She sat on Jaime's bench and did not speak for a long time. When she finally did, it was to say, "She used to come home smelling like the river when she was little. She called it her thinking place. I suppose some people never grow out of needing the water." This was not dramatic, it was human, which is to say it was sharp. Dignity in a crisis is not about being stoic. It's about not letting the language of a case reduce the person whose life is under discussion. Lena remained, for everyone who loved her, a woman who made choices and who laughed and who went missing. Word of the jacket ran through the town like a wind that brushes fallen leaves. People came to the tow yard to look, not to gawk, but to register the fact that something had happened that could not be undone. The sheriff's deputy took a photograph for the file and said in a voice that tried to stay neutral, "We will keep looking." The sentence was accurate and small consolation. By then, the motel had become a locus not merely of rumor, but of institutional focus. The manager told us, off the record, how the room had been renumbered last spring because of a complaint that made the owner uneasy. He did not like investigatory inquiries from people who smelled of ink and adrenaline. "We renumber for convenience sometimes," he said, "to align with a new operator. People forget that all the time." He told the story as if it were a small, mundane rotation, which it almost always is. The renumbering gave us a kind of technical loophole to explain the mismatch between old reports and new logs. It also made the clerk's insistence that the cameras show less mysterious and more dangerous. If the room had been recorded before renumbering, that footage might sit with different dates, and someone could misread the times. Despite the explanations, the clips continued to insist on their small, stubborn presence. They were not electric miracles or screams in the night. They were simply recordings that did not reconcile with our expectations. In the mirror, a figure leaned. On the dresser, a Polaroid sat and kept it secret. In my pocket, the first photograph warmed under my hand like a seed. The night I nearly stopped, the camera did something I could not easily explain. I had been poring over the clips again, not because we had discovered anything new, but because the mind is a machine that tries to find pattern by grinding at the same stone until it renders itself raw. The clip we watched was the one from the housekeeping camera, slow and indolent. At exactly 03:17:45, the house light on the lamp hummed and dimmed in my apartment. The lamp hum that had been a background motif in the whole affair seemed to catch up with us, as if whatever the camera had taken could also manage small changes in distant electricity. I wrote to Marco with one sentence. "Did you see that?" He wrote back, "The metadata is clean. Nothing in the file indicates power draw. Could be coincidence." Coincidence, I said aloud into my apartment that smelled of kettle and rain. The lamp hummed like an incept patient,
and a loose film of worry settled over me. I realized then how much of what we collect, what we watch, is an attempt to stitch a map for ourselves. The town wanted a map to point to an origin. The artifacts refused to be pinned. I slept badly that night and dreamed of the cracked mirror slicing a face in two. I woke early with the Polaroid still folded into my fist like a promise. Outside the window, the morning had the kind of thin clarity that towns have after rain. People walked dogs. A man fixed a fence and cursed at the bent wire. Life went on with ordinary violence and small acts of beauty. When I replayed the clips for the deputy and the clerk and Marco and Lena's mother, each new viewing rearranged the pieces in my mind. The mirror kept showing the possibility of another presence.
Sometimes it looked like a hand, other times like a shadow leaning, and once, on a frame so brief we had to slow it down, like the curve of a shoulder bent near the head in a way that suggested either closeness or an attempt to listen. We argued about how to interpret what we saw until the arguments felt silly. Labels do not always sit well on things that refuse closure. The motel clerk told me, in a low voice one evening, more of what he had seen in the footage over the years. "It's always small things," he said, "not like a face fully framed, just the sort of thing that makes you pull a blanket tight. People come and go in those rooms, you know, mostly nothing, but sometimes the lens keeps an extra thing. Maybe it is a trick of the glass, maybe it's somebody else. You can't tell a person that their reflection will start telling stories without them." When he said, "Your reflection will start telling stories," I thought of Lena tilting her head in the Polaroid and the mirror catching a shape at its edge, how a surface meant to show you back to yourself could start holding other people's sentences. I thought about how cheap rooms keep a patience you don't ask of nicer places. They hoard things, then cough them up when someone happens to shove at the right corner. We kept shoving. The watch group expanded from 3 retirees and a deputy into a loose network, volunteers who would walk the lot after midnight, a few people who had keys to spare and a kind of anxious goodwill, and Marco, who refused to call himself a conspiracy friend and instead preferred the more honest title of gadgets person. Lena's mother, stoic as ever, came to meetings with a thermos of coffee and a quiet that kept other people's panic from getting showy. The clerk would appear sometimes, sleeves rolled, explaining in the same soft, linty voice that there was nothing particularly paranormal in his ledger, except for the footage that didn't like to behave. We started cataloging everything with a seriousness that felt like ceremonial docketing. A binder lived at the library's back room, jammed between cookbooks and an out-of-print municipal code. People brought items: a matchbook from Lena's favorite diner, a ticket stub, a hair tie, a receipt with her name half scribbled. Someone scanned the Polaroids. Someone else ran low-res enhancements. Another person wrote down times and notations in a tidy hand. We learned to treat fragments as a form of prayer, attention given to what remained. There were small, almost comic attempts at explanation. "It's a trick of light," people would say, and then add in the same breath, "but the trick is consistent." The deputy, dead serious in denim and policy, was careful to remind people that nothing on a screen was proof of anything real beyond pixels and electricity. He took statements. He took inventory. He brought a calm voice to the table and a notebook with lines that made rumors look like evidence. He also sat with us and watched the same clips until his jaw showed lines I hadn't noticed before. On a wet Tuesday, the clerk called with something he described as awkward. He had found, folded inside a housekeeping log, a small scrap of paper with an address scrawled in a cramped hand and a name, Marco. The handwriting was not Lena's. No one could say for sure it was, but the clerk had left the scrap on the counter with a posture that suggested relief, as if it had been a weight he had been unwilling to carry alone. He said, "Someone left that for you," and when I asked him whether he thought he had put it there himself, he blinked and admitted everything about us looked like the sort of trouble the owner preferred not to catalog. We decided to try a controlled recording. If cameras showed things, perhaps more cameras, set up by method and not left to happenstance, would show what the happenstance had been. We asked the manager for permission to use room 304 overnight as an evidence run. He agreed, reluctantly, with the kind of consent that wanted to be done as quickly as possible and forgotten. The deputy came along, cross-checked our IDs, and sat in his truck as if his presence alone might lend gravity to electronics. We weren't trying to bait anything. We were trying to be careful, which is to say we wanted as many eyes as possible to be on the room while leaving the room itself as undisturbed as possible. Marco brought a tripod and a small camcorder, and we left a portable recorder on the dresser near the cracked mirror. We placed a small wide-angle camera in the hallway and another on the far end of the bed aimed at the mirror, all with buffer batteries and timecode stamps. Marco kept his laptop in the car, and I carried the Polaroid and the slip of SOR like talismans that were awkward to hold. At the clerk's suggestion, we left the door cracked the way he had asked me to before. He stood on the parking lot and watched the shadow of our car make the puddles shiver. He told me, almost as an afterthought, sometimes people ask to record themselves when they're there. It changes the room, even if nothing else does. We sat inside as volunteers rotated in and out of the hallway. For a little while it felt not unlike a science experiment, methodical, calm. I read press clippings aloud from the table while the deputy made a grocery list on his phone. Marco fussed with levels, polishing the lenses like a man in prayer. Lena's mother came for the first hour and blew the steam off her coffee in a damp exhale. She touched the Polaroid on the table and said she used to hum when she did dishes, and the sound made the room less clinical and more like a place that had been lived in. Sometime after midnight, when fatigue had paper-cut our edges, I asked to be the one to sit in the bed while the cameras ran. Perhaps it was narcissism.
Perhaps it was a strange offer to be the human subject so the other humans could see what might happen. The deputy stayed in the hallway but kept his flashlight on the walkway. Marco promised he'd be monitoring the feeds in the car and would come inside if anything odd occurred. There was a legitimate effort to keep things safe. I lay on the bed, palms flat, the sheet creasing like new paper. The lamp hummed as if it were listening. The cracked mirror fanned the room into thin second copies of itself. For long minutes there was nothing but the mundane, distant engines, the intermittent sputter of neon. The camera on the dresser recorded in silent, impartial bites. I read the words from a note I'd written in the back of the binder, observations, times, anything that made the body of evidence more legible, and then I closed my eyes for a tired breath. Later, tucked into the car with Marco, we watched the footage back. The hallway cam recorded the deputy leaning against the doorframe and the clerk pacing. The dresser cam recorded me reading, turning, and settling. The wide angle over the bed captured the whole room like a patient, indifferent eye. At 01:34:07, the dresser cam, framed to include the mirror, caught something that made my stomach slide out from under me. I am in the frame alone, reading with the light from the phone across my hands pooling like a small, warm pain. The mirror behind me shows the room as the camera sees it, and then it shows, for a fraction of a second, someone else standing behind me in the mirror. Not merely a shadow, not merely a smudge, a silhouette in the glass, leaning in, head tilted, posture skewed toward me as if listening or whispering. In the dresser shot's angle, the space behind the bed is empty. The wide-angle bed cam confirms it. Nothing there, just a slight rumple where I had been sitting. The hallway feed shows the deputy and the clerk outside the door, talking behind a smoke of breath. Marco checks his watch and says nothing. We rewound until the pixels were squares of time and then slowed the clip to a crawl. The mirror image had the dimension of a person, the suggestion of shoulders and a collar. It did not entirely resolve into clear anatomy. More than anything, it resolved into presence. In the mirror, my head turned. In the mirror, the other form leaned in a fraction closer. At 01:34:07, the image in the mirror seemed to breathe with me. For a moment, my breath on the actual camera matched the rise and fall of the version of me in reflection. Then the footage jittered, a few frames cut out as if a file had hiccuped, and when it returned, I was still alone in every feed. The mirror held the trace of a person no one else had seen. Marco sat there rubbing his eyes, the laptop light carving lines across his face. The deputy, who had patronized superstition all evening, said quietly, "We should log that. We should mark it." His voice had a tremor that wasn't his usual professional steady.
Could be an overlay, Marco said. Could be a compression artifact. Could be something delayed in the sensor that recorded an old frame. We listed explanations the way people in rooms list emergency numbers. None of them felt satisfying. None gave the figure a reason to be there. None explained why the mirror kept holding someone in that particular posture, close, intimate, as if to be heard. When I looked back at the footage again in the morning, alone in my kitchen with a cup that had gone cold, I noticed another thing.
For one frame, the mirror showed a hand that wasn't mine resting on the dresser's edge. It was brief, 3 frames, and the audio recorded a soft static that many would interpret as nothing, but to my ears it sounded like a small intake of breath into fabric. Marco's analysis would later call it a low-frequency artifact and probable environmental noise. The deputy would file it and mark it for the case. The binder would get another lined page. We published nothing at first. We didn't need to. The footage seeped through the town as carefully as ink through blotting paper. People came to the motel more often, but not to provoke. They came because when a place begins to hold stories, the people who pass it on want to know if the thing will settle itself or keep speaking. The night watch became less performative and more necessary. The watch group pitched tents in the lot, but not like campers. They set up camp chairs and thermoses, and someone brought cards for a game of gin that nobody had the attention span to play. The man in the long coat started being seen more often. He did not speak much. He would pass the lot at odd hours with something wrapped in brown paper. Once, a neighbor recognized his gait. He had been in town for years, a carrier who kept a route, never sadistic, never malevolent, just a person who wore neutral coats and kept to himself. People tried to be kind to him. He accepted a coffee once and nodded. He admitted nothing. He was both an adjacency and a background, a figure we could place without making him a villain. When people saw him in the footage, they pointed him out, not in the mirror, but on the street outside, camera catching him blurred by movement. He became a visual motif, like the lamp hum or the cracked mirror. As the artifacts accumulated, there came one piece that made the town stop and breathe differently, a video a neighbor called the mirror clip, shot from the motel's interior by an anonymous hand. It starts with the mirror and Lena at the window, the crack splitting light. The figure in the mirror leans in so close that the hairline reflections brush. There is an indistinct whisper under the file's single audio channel. If you raise the volume, something like 2 syllables emerges. Sorry. It is not clean. It could be wishful listening. It could be the room's pipes. It could be Lena's breath on a lonely night.
We played it for Lena's mother, and she closed her eyes and mouthed the words as if tasting them for the first time. At the tow yard, where the jacket had been shelved like an inventory item, Jaime told a story in the smoky light of his shop that later read like an origin myth no one had consented to create. I was cleaning up after a long week, he said, and by the bank I found a jacket, like someone took it off and left it on a rock. I figured I'd hang it until someone came asking. You can't keep a thing like that lying around. People deserve their things back. He shrugged, and the shrug told us how common decency operates in a small town. You find something, you keep it in a safe place, you watch to see if anyone comes. Jaime did not claim to have seen Lena. He claimed to have found the jacket and to have felt the weirdness of a weight stitched into its seams. When Lena's mother finally let me into her house after a week and asked me to sit with her in her kitchen, she made tea and spoke without obliging our desire for pattern. When she was little, she said, she would take a rock down to the river and balance it on another rock. She said she was making a place for ghosts to rest so they wouldn't bump into people at night. She laughed then, the laugh that belonged more to memory than the moment. I used to tell her ghosts are just stories people tell when they don't know what else to feel, but people are very good at living with stories. There are ethical lines you don't cross when someone you care about is missing. We didn't make the story mean more than it did. Lena had agency. She had been more than a set of artifacts. She had a life that preceded the Polaroids and would continue in people's memories, if not in the files. We honored that. We also kept watching. One afternoon, after a flurry of anonymous posts and a local radio segment that treated the motel like an attraction, a new piece of footage arrived in my inbox with no subject line. The file name itself was a jumble of numbers and letters that meant nothing. I played it alone, the apartment lamp humming as it always did. The clip is short, 42 seconds, and it's shot as if from within somebody's shirt pocket. It starts with the frame of the mirror and then tilts. Lena is in the mirror, turning a small circle as if searching the room. Behind her, in the mirror only, there is a figure that leans and then, impossibly, places something against the glass. For one beat, the reflection shows a hand smoothing the mirror's cracked hairline. And then, as the person turns, the reflection separates from the motion in the visible room. Lena in the reflection appears to mouth something that doesn't match the movement of her actual lips. If you close your eyes and replay it, the mismatch becomes a kind of syntax of absence.
At the end of the clip, the mirror shows the two-line message scrout backwards across the glass like it had been written there earlier. Don't come.
Please tell them I'm sorry. The lettering is reversed as letters become in a mirror. The handwriting is not Lena's, and yet it distinctly matches the rhythm of the SOR on the folded slip. When the clip finishes, my lamp hums louder, and the kettle whistles for no reason at all. There was a person, an actual human, who believed in the symbolic power of leaving messages, and someone else who could manipulate footage well enough to insert backward writing. Those are possibilities. There is also the possibility that a surface that reflects will sometimes arrange its lights in ways that look like letters. We kept every hypothesis in the binder. We also kept the clip. Then came the jacket at the river, the fold inside it like a pause. The deputy had the jacket bagged and documented. There was no blood on it when Jaime found it. There were no prints that matched anyone in our files. What the jacket did carry was another Polaroid and a short folded note in handwriting that looked like the same cramped block letters, SOR. Lena's mother took the jacket home and unfolded the Polaroid with a gentleness that suggested ritual. She didn't show it to anyone outside the room. It was the way the town reacted that marked a real change. People stopped entering the lot to gawk. They started coming to be present, to offer hot soup, to leave flowers. The watch group's tone shifted from investigative to memorial. We were still cataloging, we were still logging, but we were also more and more attending, a verb that in a small town means both the administrative and the ethical. The deputy increased patrols around the motel with a professional seriousness that did not pretend to explain anything, but did promise to keep the ledger open. One evening, as light slanted across the diner panes and the rain made the pavement shine like a coin, the sheriff brought a small team and announced they'd been able to pull a degraded audio file from the motel's older server. The file was incomplete, the sort of thing you can either interpret as noise or as message, depending on how tender your ears are. We sat in the back room of the library and played it. The recording was grainy. First you hear the hummed bass line of fluorescent lights, and then a voice. Lena's voice, soft, the phrase we've come to know by heart. Please don't come. Please tell them I'm sorry. Beneath it, at the edge of hearing, there is something that might be static, or might be breath, or might be someone else shifting a sweater. The deputy wrote down times and technical detail, and then closed his notebook and said, in the way someone closes up a spill, it's part of the file now. No one asked him to say more. It was enough that what we had loved as a rumor had the shape of evidence. It was also not enough to be anything salvageable. After the jacket's discovery, the watch group held a small vigil by the river at dusk. People lit candles and left small items. A coin, a Polaroid someone swore was found but wasn't theirs, a note written in careful pen. We sat in a row of folding chairs and watched the current take light like paper. Lena's mother stood with a thermos and a look that was less about waiting for an answer and more about living with the absence. She told us stories of Lena's childhood, how she would race stones across the water until they slowed under the weight of gravity. We remember who they were, she said, not how they might become in a headline. In the weeks that followed, the files grew, then stalled. New footage sank into the binder, and old clips seemed to breathe less sharply. The watch group's attendance waned and then recalibrated into smaller, steadier groups who would come sometimes to leave a boiled egg on Lena's mother's porch, and sometimes to simply sit in the lot and keep the pace of human presence in the motel's orbit. People went back to work. The clerk cleaned rooms and added asterisks in his log. Jaime kept an eye on lost things at the tow yard. Marco returned to more practical projects and built a small plexiglass box for the Polaroids so they wouldn't fade under light. And yet some things didn't relent. Once a week, an anonymous text would arrive on my phone at 3 a.m. Sometimes it would be silence. Once it was a single photo of the cracked mirror from an angle I'd never seen. Once it was a voicemail, no voice, just the sound of running water and the indistinct thud of a foot on a staircase. The messages didn't ask for attention so much as resupply it. They were reminders that the town still had a small open wound. One night, months later, I found myself unable to sleep. The Polaroid rested on my nightstand like a quiet arguer. I put a small glass over the slip of paper with SOR, and, in a gesture that felt childish, traced the letters with a fingertip from the other side of the glass. The lamp hummed, obliging as ever. In the middle of that night, the phone buzzed again. I read the 2 lines because they had become, in their brevity, an anchor we could not unmoor. Don't come. Please tell them I'm sorry. I set the phone down, and against their sense, I played the room's recorded footage from that night on my living room TV. The clip was from the dressing cam we'd left in room 304 months ago, archived now, a little dusty in the file structure. And there, in the middle of the footage, there is a time-stamped frame where the mirror records me sitting at the same desk in my kitchen, the Polaroid visible on the table behind me. In my TV, my room is not the motel, it's the domestic, the private.
And yet for 3 frames, the mirror in the motel clip shows a presence behind the version of me in that living room shot. I was watching a filmed mirror show someone standing behind me at my own kitchen table. I rewound and checked the file data, and then checked the camera metadata.
The clip's time codes were messy, nested, and in one folder there was a cross-link to a camera at the library where the watch group's meetings had been recorded. If you dig into the formats, you can assemble a plausible chain of technical errors that make mirrors and reflections double back on themselves. If you dig differently, you can say that footage from different nights was collated in a way that produced a palimpsest of presence. Both statements would be true in their register. I put the Polaroid back into its plexiglass box and slid the slip of paper into the binder. The binder has become, in its way, the thing that keeps us honest, a ledger that resists tidy narration. Marco, ever the practical soul, suggested archiving all footage in 3 separate backups and keeping a public-facing log so the town could see what had been recorded and when. The deputy agreed, and the clerk, with a small, fatalistic nod, donated a thumb drive to the cause. A journalist came one afternoon from the city, the kind who asks direct questions and then listens as if answers could be squeezed out like juice. She asked me whether I believed in ghosts. I said that belief is not the metric, attention is. You are not meant to believe or disbelieve, I told her. You are meant to look and to tell. The phrase felt truer than I expected. People come to these stories wanting resolution, but often the moral labor of them is bearing witness. We never found Lena. The evidence never folded into a narrative that closed with her name and a location. The jacket at the river confirmed that she had been somewhere a while ago. The Polaroids and the clips confirmed that there had been a pattern of strange reflections and intercepts in a room that had been renumbered and repurposed. The town learned to live with a set of circulating images that suggested company where there might have been none. The deputy kept his file open. The clerk kept his hands on the keyring, and sometimes, late at night when people drifted by, he would tell them quietly the same line he told me the first night. If you go in, leave the door cracked. Watch the mirror. There is a cruelty to unresolved things. They do not allow tidy mourning. But unresolvedness also allows memory to remain vital. Lena's mother took to visiting the river more often. She sat on the bench and would sometimes speak into the air as if the water might be a telephone. She liked when the stones ricocheted. She didn't plead for answers she knew she wouldn't get. She simply made the space for remembering, and in that repetition created a litany that kept Lena present in a manner more gentle than headlines. The town's watch became less an act of detection and more a practice of protection. People left notes on the motel's front glass window. If you need help, call. And beneath it, in a different hand, we are keeping watch. Some nights, a small group would play cards and talk about nothing and everything.
One of the retirees from the group, Mrs. Alvarez's cousin, brought a music box once and wound it while we talked. The notes sounded like an old radio and made the motel lot feel less like a set piece and more like a shared human sphere. There were still oddities. A doll with red thread appeared once more, sewn neat across its back, left on the steps of the library like a bookmark for an unread page. Someone found hair on a parking curb and turned it in. Boots that weren't anyone's were seen walking out of the lot at dawn and then dissolving into the street. We cataloged each thing, and then we let it sit. The deputy encouraged people to treat their curiosity with caution. He reminded us that correlation is not causation, and that sometimes coincidences accumulate into worry. He did not, however, mock the formal act of paying attention to people's grief.
We copied the files. We watched one together in low light. The file, labeled in a hand that had been careful with the labels, had a timestamp that matched a date when I had stopped by the lot to look at a neon sign. The clip is grainy, but there is a moment, less than a second, where a mirror in the motel's room catches, obviously and clearly, the outline of someone standing behind me. It is not an ambiguous silhouette. It is an outline that suggests shoulders and the tilt of the head. The clerk, watching with us, rubbed his thumb across the edge of the table, as if smoothing something he couldn't quite iron flat. "You see," he said, softly. I didn't know what to say. I had been present for much of the cataloging and the camped vigils and the informal remembrance. I had sat inside the room and watched monitors until digital grain felt like stone. I had held Lena's things and spoken to her mother and archived the clips. The new file didn't explain. It only confirmed that the way the motel collected images had a persistence that outlived our intentions. The man in the long coat was seen on the lot that afternoon, walking at a distance and pausing to look at the motel before moving on. He did not speak with us. He left what looked like a small envelope folded under the reception desk. The clerk found it later and opened it with hands that were reluctant and curious. Inside was a slip of paper with 3 letters, S-O-R. There are ways to interpret that moment. One could say the man in the coat had been more attentive than we'd given him credit for. One could say he had been leaving tokens, or that someone had passed him the note to pass on. One could say, with equal honesty, that it was coincidence and that human beings like patterns, and our need for them stamps meaning into random events. We do the best we can. We tally, we arc, we remember. The lights of the motel continue to flicker in a rhythm that feels like a pulse. The clerk cleans rooms and keeps an eye on the mirror. The deputy logs calls and does his work. Lena's mother comes to the river and sits with the thermos and the small remembrance of stones. The town moves around these rituals the way a town moves around a tree that has lost a limb, cautious, changed, but still willing to have picnics underneath. Sometimes I think about the ethical core of what we did. We did not turn Lena into a story without a name. We tried to carry artifacts with tenderness and to document the unanswerable with dignity. We sought truth in the tight, prosaic places, filed dates, preserved Polaroids, copied drives. We also lit candles and left flowers and let people remember without pressure. I suppose that's some kind of justice. On nights when the phone buzzes at 3 and I roll over with sleep in my knuckles, I read the 2-line message like an instruction and a prayer. Don't come. Please tell them I'm sorry. Sometimes the message is noise.
Sometimes it's an image or a clip or a prank that someone thought would be clever. Sometimes it is the echo of a recorder left running by accident. And sometimes, rarely, in a way that insists on ambiguity, it arrives with the weight of someone who once trusted that the world would hear them. I keep the Polaroid on my shelf and the binder in the library. I keep watching the occasional clip because attention is an act of preservation. When you look, you keep memory from evaporating into rumor. I do not seek more evidence the way a hunter seeks prey. I seek it the way someone waters a plant, not to force it into the showy bloom, but to preserve the life that remains. If you have a motel story, or a photograph that doesn't behave the way you'd expect, or a small object that keeps turning up in places it shouldn't, say it somewhere that watches and listens. The town runs on witnesses, and the act of telling can be a form of protection. Leave your story in the comments, or if you prefer, keep it safe until someone you trust asks. Either way, bear it with care. The lamp hums, a patient insect. The cracked mirror still holds its small, doubled world. Room 304 stays with its own history, part renumbered, part remembered. Sometimes, when I pass the motel on the route home, I slow, not to look for signs, but to be present to the fact that people have losses that do not resolve. Bearing witness is imperfect, but it is necessary. The 2-line message returns in my head sometimes as an apology from a stranger, and as a warning to anyone who might mistake curiosity for courage. I don't know what happened to Lena. I don't know if the figures in the mirror were tricks of light, edits, or something else beyond our categories. I know with the sturdiness of human experience that she existed, and that people loved her, and that we kept the artifacts in order because dignity demanded it. And
And when now and then the cameras show in a frame that someone was near when our eyes said otherwise, we keep watching, we keep cataloging, we keep telling. Don't come. Please tell them I'm sorry.